How did you become an author?
Well, it's kind of a complex story, and I think every author probably has that same feeling about how they became an author. It really started when I was young. I loved to write. I did a creative writing contest when I was like 5, and that was actually the first thing I got published was a Christmas poem. But it really started more when I was in college, when I was kind of a poor college student. On my time off, besides reading books, I would write creatively just to do something different. I'm predominantly in the medical field. So creative writing was like a nice break for me. But when I really got started as an author, really came out of counseling. So a couple very catastrophic events happened in my life, one involving my father getting very, very ill, and another involving my professional career kind of happened simultaneously. And I actually started going to counseling because I was in just a very, very bad place in my life, and I was unable to reconcile what was happening to me and how things were really spiraling out of control. So I started working with my counselor, and we tried medication, which really didn't work for me. We tried dialoguing about what was happening in my life, and I just was really unable to articulate what was happening to me. So she asked me, did I have any outlets for my feelings? Was I an artist? What did I do with my spare time? And sadly, at that time in my life, really, I lived for my job. So I didn't have a creative outlet, but I did tell her, at one point in my life, I did like to write a little bit creatively. So she suggested I go home and do a little creative writing and bring it back. I was actually seeing her about 3 times a week because things were very serious at that point in time. It was not a good place in my life. So I ended up going home and dialoguing with my husband. And I was a huge fan of history. I love to read about the Revolutionary War. I love to read about World War II. And I had kind of muddled around during college with a couple different stories. But again, they were creative. They weren't really meant to be seen by anybody. So I came back and saw her a couple days later. And I had chosen a Revolutionary War story that I had kind of, like I said, written when I was in college, but I really didn't have it anymore. That computer was long gone. But anyway, I brought her in a few pages and she said, okay, you're going to read these to me. And I was like, you want me to read these to you? You know, you really want to look at this? And she said, yeah, please read them to me. And it really was the opening scene of the Rebels in Redcoat saga, actually the first book, The Tory. And the first line of it is, karma is a whore that always gets paid. But what is the price when there's so much blood on your hands? And my counselor looked at me and she's like, okay, what does that mean? Why is the character saying this? What's going on? And she, I replied back to her, well, because his life just sucks. All these terrible things happen to him. And she's like, what terrible things happen to him? So then it really manifested in me coming every day and sometimes, 3 times a week and then sometimes once a week. And I would read these pages to her and we would dialogue about what was going on with this character and what was happening in his story. And what I didn't realize at the time was she was using it as a tool. Instead of me journaling, because I was incapable of writing and dialoguing about my life, I was inadvertently writing about what was happening in my personal life, but hiding it under layers of the fiction and the history. So when I actually finished that entire book per se, it was called The Traitor and it was all one book. And she said to me at that time, now I want you to let somebody read this. And I looked at her, I'm like, well, no one's meant to read this. I didn't do that much research. This was just something we were doing, as a tool. She said, no, this is something I want you to do. Understand that I was a researcher in my private life. So like writing for me and researching and those kinds of things were just a part of the staple of my life. So the idea of letting somebody read this when it wasn't edited and looked at and cleaned up was, kind of terrifying to me. But I handed it over to a very good friend of mine. And she read it and she said, this is very raw, but it's also very good. And so that kind of started the idea behind, do I ever want to publish this? Flash forward, I did end up going to a conference known as Romantic Times. It's no longer around, but I met a lot of independent authors and I met a lot of authors and they were all very encouraging. And I ended up chatting with an editor about the story. And, she said, well, this sounds really interesting, but you really need to work with an editor to help you decide what to do with it. Is it good? How to build it, foster it, create it, make it grow, make it have a life, right? All those things that do to become a book. And again, I was kind of sitting there going, this was never the goal to become an author, but I did end up finding someone who became my editor, and she got the book and said, well, we need to break it in half because it's a very long story. But she said, I actually really like this idea. I think this is a very interesting story. It's very crude. So that's kind of the start of how I became an author. It was really through counseling. And I can be very honest and say that every one of my books that I've written, Man o' War, The Tory, The Traitor, The Turncoat, and now The Rebel, are all kind of done the same way. My counselor and I, who I still continue to see, obviously not as frequently, we dialogue about what's happening in my life, and then a lot of it comes through my self-discovery in the writing process. It's not the same anymore where I'm actually reading those pages to her, but I'm using the characters in the story to self-discover. And when we talk a little bit more about Man o' War, you're going to find out exactly, how that really played into this story. But when we talk about the Tory and the Traitor, which was originally all the one book, The Traitor, I was really literally every time I sing her, bringing in those pages, dialoguing with her, and working through my problems. So that's really how I got started as an author. The truth is, I never actually had like an author name or considered a website or a web page or any of those things until the day I actually had to have a cover. My cover artist said to me, "What's your pen name? What's your name?" And I was like, oh gosh, I probably need one of those, right? So I never actually considered myself an author until really I held the physical copy of The Tory in my hands. And that actually did not happen until I was at Romantic Times in 2018. And I was going to be a featured independent author at this event. So that's actually how I became an author, I would say. But the story is ongoing. It's an ongoing process, and I think it is for every author. But that's the quick and dirty.